Well, the question today is, will we succeed? Will we succeed? Will we succeed? That's a good question, isn't it? It's a big one. And the answer depends on what we measure. I grew up in a small church in Dundas, Ontario. We were called Valley Community Church, and we never had our own building. My parents and my aunt and uncle and Ken Weidrich and his wife and a few helped plant that church in the early 80s. And it was work. We rented a little theater. There's the Dundas Valley Little Theater, and a little community theater kind of right beside the arena and the pool, nestled right in between there. It was pretty close to our house. It was only about a 5 or 8 minute walk, and it was really something we did all the time is walk to church. And then because we were in another organization's building, we always had to set up. And so at times when our numbers were not as high, we would sit in the foyer. They had a big enough foyer, and so we just set up chairs, and we had service there in the foyer. And then when other times, we would have it in their theater part, where it's a bigger area. And it also depended on whether or not the stage that was being built, what level of construction was going on in the theater section. When it was all done and everything was up, well, they had sort of stadium seating and nicely all laid out on risers and all that, and it was really good. But I learned a lot from that little church. I think at its zenith, it probably had about 45 people, maybe at the max. And there was times where I had cousins there. There were some other kids. We had Bible clubs. We had all sorts of little things going there. But the one thing I learned there was service. Like, everybody's a team member, because, or at least that's how it felt. And my family, if you're in my family, that's at least how it was, for sure. So, and Dad was always involved, so often it would be his turn, so he'd have the keys, he'd go open up and disarm the alarm, and I'd be early, and we'd set up the chairs. Through the years, I played piano for offertories. We had Christmas plays. There was many a time where Dad had a towel on his head in order to be a shepherd or some other biblical character. Little theater, right? So, but I learned a lot there. You learn to do community because it's such a small group of people, and you do life together over the years. Easter and Christmas and this and that, and you learn to love those people, and they learn to love you. My parents would send me, I could drive then, so there was an elderly lady named Ruth Pike, and I would drive up just to the next little village over. It was only 10 minutes away, and I'd go pick her up in Greensville, and I'd bring her back and bring her to church. Because I was a teenager, I had my license, you want to drive? And I'd drive for any reason. So, okay, go pick up Mrs. Pike. So I used to do that, and now in our house, we have a keyboard that had been donated to our church in memory of Mrs. Pike, and that's what Ezra practices on. So there's these ties and connections and relationships, and people come and go and move in and move out, and some die and some come, and there's a whole lifetime of relationships that are there, and I was invited back to help with their closing service as well, which was a few years back, and was able to preach at that, which was a real honor to be there. But I know that part of the question that was lingering is, did we fail or did we succeed? We never made it. Like, we never grew that big. We never got hundreds of people. We never built our own building. Did we succeed? Well, from there I went to college in Camrose. I went to Gardner College, which was a Church of God school there, mostly for kind of Bible training, and I started my training to be a pastor there, and I went to the Camrose Church of God. And at that time, it was basically in its heyday. Like, it was at its zenith as far as number of people, And I remember probably about my third year, I had to preach. I had a preaching class, and so they scheduled me to preach at the Camrose Church of God. And on that Sunday, there was 323 people. And that was my first sermon on a Sunday morning. And it was like, whoa, there's tons of people here. And I remember sitting up in a chair on stage beside Pastor Brian Crucial, and I was like, whoa, so this is what sardines look like. Like, it was packed. And I was pretty nervous, and I'm sure it was a really bad sermon. But it was a great experience, and they let me learn and grow, and it was a whole different experience to have a church that had a building even. Like, they have a building. But it was important. It was a neat and a very good growing experience for those few years there in Camrose. And then from there, I got an opportunity to go and work with the church in Guam with Gwen and Gary Bisterton. And I went there and helped with their youth group, and then eventually became their lead pastor at Touchpoint. But at Touchpoint, we didn't have a building either. Well, we did, but it was actually like an apartment. We had these two parallel apartments that had 3 apartments on each side on the property. And then on the one side, it was sort of like converted into a little bit of a fellowship hall that we used for worship services for a while. And then we had the opportunity to use a space, so we went to a golf course. And we used one of their clubhouse, big, large rooms up in the clubhouse of a golf course. And we met there for a year or so. And then we rented a Seventh-day Adventist church for a year or so. And because the Seventh-day Adventists meet on Saturdays. So there's nobody using it Sundays, so we used it on Sundays for a while and had a church building with pews and all that. And it was, that kind of felt good at the time. And so we had moved around as this little group of Touchpoint people as well. We had probably around the same, maybe 40 or 50 people involved with that congregation. Then I went to seminary in Anderson, and I went to I guess technically it'd be called a mega church. I went to Madison Park. It was the big one in town. There was 2,500 seat auditorium. And I wanted to see what that was like because it was so foreign to me. And I thought, I wonder what it's like to go to a church with 2,500 seats in the auditorium. So I went there for a little while, and the pastor there was Jim Lyon, who's now the director for the Church of God in North America. And he was a great communicator. They had a choir. They had a program for everything. They had multiple staff. They had all sorts of stuff. They had really good gift bags if you visited the first Sunday. They had lunch, they had food, they had all sorts of things there. It was pretty impressive in a lot of ways. But I remember hearing people say, oh yeah, I go to Madison Park. I said, oh really, me too. I said, yeah, so what do you think of Jim Lyon? Do you know him? Do you like him? Like, oh yeah, I met him once. Yeah, he was very nice. And I was like, that's your pastor? How have you only met your pastor once? Yeah, no, he was a great guy. It was like about a year ago, like when I was, he greeted me, and it was like, oh, he seems like a really nice guy. He's good, great messages. Now, I love Jim Lyon. He's a great guy. He really is. But he knew me because he'd come up to Canada. He'd interviewed me for a radio program after I did a mission trip and whatever, and he remembers me and my parents. He'd be like, oh, greet your parents. He knows they run the child sponsorship. So it's so weird for me to go to church within a week or two, and the pastor knows me, and there'll be people there that have been there for a couple years, and they didn't even know their pastor. Oh yeah, I met him once. So there's pros and cons to going to a big church, and I found I really didn't like it that much. They did great stuff, and I had friends that worked there, and I loved, they're great. They did great work. But I just found for me, I just needed something a little smaller. When you grew up in a church of 4,500 is too much. So I went over to South Meridian, and that's where Pastor Ed Hyatt, who used to be in Swift Current here in Canada, he was just starting out, and I joined their church. And they were going through some transition they had already bought land at the south of town where Madison Park was, right near there. They bought land years earlier, but they didn't do anything with it. Then Madison Park bought land and built and established that church. And so South Meridian was like, well, what do we do now? They kind of beat us down to that end of the city. Should we still do something or not? And they decided not to. And they decided, let's stay in our neighborhood. because we live in a neighborhood where there's a lot of needs. There are a lot of high needs families, and we feel like God is calling us to be here in this neighborhood, not to move out of town. There's already a church there, for one, and two, that's not what God's calling us to do. God's calling us to be here, planted here, to do the work here among these people. That's where I did my first trunk or treat. So I spent the rest of the time there at South Meridian, watching and observing how Ed Hyatt was working with an old church that was probably 105 years old when I was there. And they had a long history. And to make changes, it's like steering it. And the older and bigger the church, the more it's like a larger ship that has to turn around. Like it takes a lot of time and a space and effort to turn that thing around, to go in a different direction. And then after seminary, basically came here. It was my main next experience. And we've had some ups and downs here. And I've been learning how to do church. And I remember even thinking I never thought I would be the pastor at a church that had a beautiful building. And so coming here, again, like a really beautiful facility, it's all paid off. It's such a nice building and place, wow, this is really neat. Always in my head, throughout all of those different experiences, I think I had this idea or this assumption that what it means to succeed is to fill the pews, to have a nice building with a lot of people that fill the pews. And I never had that as a kid, and so someday, and then when I was at those churches, it felt great, like it was nice. There was lots of things you can do with that. But as we come and find ourselves where we are, I'm asking again, as the leader of this church, will we succeed? And it depends on what we measure. It depends on what we measure. So today, this isn't really a sermon. It's kind of a little bit of an update and a story. I just want to share with you where I'm at, where we're at, or some of how I'm seeing things. I want to hear from you as well. This is a limiting environment, but if you do have questions, please feel free to ask. But I just wanted to share a bit of where I'm at. So in 2020, I would say I hit a bit of a wall myself. Not in an accident. I wasn't in an accident. But personally, 2020 was a hard year. Many of you remember it was a very hard year for a lot of us. That was COVID came in March. We were all figuring out what to do. There were so many different challenges and things to sort out and so many unknowns, hitting a bit of a wall where I felt like I wasn't leading out of who I am. I felt like there's a big part of me that I wasn't able to share with our church. Not some dark secret part, but just more of how I'm wired and who I am. And I was like, you know what? I'm not really living into that or out of that. And I didn't like that feeling. Part of it, I felt there was a tension, like we didn't really have space for nuance in our understanding. I felt like there was a lot of black and white thinking, and it was either this or that. And you're either in or you're out, or you're either up or you're down, or you're either what or what. And there's this sort of like very distinctive, and I felt like, man, that is not how I experience God, and that's not how I experience life. That's not how I experience the Scripture. Like there's a lot of nuance. And there's some really hard questions that aren't answered very easily, even with our Bible. And I was feeling this tension of, can I actually talk about that stuff with you, with our church? Or is there no place for that? So I decided to change a little bit how I speak and how I write and what I wrote about and spoke about. And so in part, that's part of why some people left. They didn't like that or didn't agree with that. But I felt like it was important for me, if I was going to be your pastor, I had to learn to be me more in this role. And then in this past 77 days, this is the last of our bit of a journey. September 11th till today has been 11 weeks, 77 days, and I've told you about a journey. I hit a little bit of another wall here in this last season. I came to a point where I really didn't know what to do. And I was feeling a lot of pressure. And what I realized is I was carrying an idea of success that I couldn't measure up to. Still hanging on to some of those old thoughts where, that success would be, to fill all of the pews. Now, I'm not saying I don't want people to come, but I also don't think that that's the main measure of success. And part of it was I had a Monday. Oftentimes Mondays are harder because after Sunday there's a lot of preparation, there's a lot of exertion, and I'm presenting and leading and all of this. And then Mondays are sometimes a bit of a down day for pastors. There's usually a bit of a recovery of thinking, I should have done this, I should have said that, or I shouldn't have said that, or I didn't get to talk with so-and-so, or I missed out on them, or I meant to say this, but I forgot. And, there's that sort of, you replay something in your head, and that often happens. But I had a Monday a few weeks ago, and it was bad. I just felt like I was such a failure. I felt like I have no answers. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm the wrong person for this job. I just think, what am I doing here? God, if I have to do church like that, I don't even know. I don't know what I should be doing. And I had to pray pretty hard through that. I had to kind of come back to some of those truths, and I've told you about this before, where when we have days like that, it's how do we anchor ourselves, right? I had to come back to say, no, here's what I know is true. God loves me, and it's not based on what I do for Him. I know that I am called to be here. I know that God is at work in our midst, even though it doesn't feel like that today to me. And then even to take thoughts captive. And I guess generally it's called spiritual warfare, but to say, if any of these thoughts are not from you, Lord, or if it's from the enemy or the accuser, then I take those captive and I give them to you. I'm getting rid of those because that's not how you see me. That's not what you say about me. I'm not a failure. And you're with me. And I will just lean into that. Now, I still felt like garbage that day, but I had to just repeat that. I had to replay the tape. Just again, no, God loves me. I know I'm called to be here. I know I'm doing the work God's called me to do. And that's what I'm going to rely on. But, there's a lot of fears that come up with that. Can I do it? Are we going to fail? Am I going to fail? I was thinking about even this, one of the things here, testing. Number 5, I talked about in our very first week, testing. Man, that was a real day of testing. There were trials. I come to realize I have a lot of fear. I have a lot of fear in this job. One of those fears is rejection. There's been a lot of rejection over the last 2 years. Every time a family leaves, it feels rejection to me. It hurts. Some of you feel that too, but I tell you, I feel it every time. Even if it's just moving away because you had to move for a job, it always feels personal, even though it's not, a lot of times. So that hurts. And I've had fear of that, fear of rejection. And I still grieve the loss of some of the relationships that we have lost from people who've left. It lingers. And what do you do with that? And then I'll feel all good. And then you run into somebody at the arena. Or you run into somebody at the grocery store. Or you see them on the road or something like that. And you just, all of a sudden there's these memories. And boy, that's tough. I've had a fear that you all would have a lack of patience for this slow journey that we're on. This has taken some time. Spiritual formation is really slow. And it feels like God is slow. That God doesn't work fast enough. Sometimes that's how I feel. For the slow journey. I fear sometimes that I'm not enough. Or that I'm not the right guy for the job. That, maybe somebody else would do this job better. And they would have a better idea of how to lead. They would have answers. They would be able to really get this thing going and back on track or whatever that's supposed to be. Maybe I'm not enough for the right guy. Or even just that last one of failure. Fear of failure. Maybe I'm going to fail. I don't want to fail. I don't want to let you down. I don't want to let God down. I don't want to let my family down. What will I do? What job would I get next if I failed? What would failure be? I fear that the church would slowly just fade away because I messed up or I didn't do something right. Anyway, that was my Monday a couple of weeks ago. And I just realized, I've been really sort of operating out of a lot of fears. And the problem with that, it's very natural. Maybe you've felt this in some of your jobs, your family life, or whatever it is. It's very natural, I think. But the problem is, if I'm going to be able to lead this group, I can't do it out of fear, right? I need to do it out of love. And the Bible tells us that perfect love drives out fear. If we're working and living out of fear, we're in the grip of anxiety. We're not able to really love people because we're defensive or we're guarding ourselves. We're not willing to be vulnerable. And so I'm working on myself. Part of what this has been over the last 11 weeks as I'm trying to lead you all, but it's actually, God's doing a lot of stuff in me. Because if I'm going to be the leader that you need me to be or that God needs me to be, He's got to do the work in me first. And it's hard work. I really can't do it without God's help. But I would also say, God in His mercy led me to a podcast that was very encouraging. And it helped me to change my perspective a bit. Because if we ask the question, will we succeed? Well, I would still say it depends on what we measure. And this podcast helped me to put the old tape measure away. I gave up the imperial, and I'm going metric. I'm changing how we measure, how I measure. And we've talked about a little bit with our leadership team. But one of the things they talked about was the idea of how, generally speaking, we like technical solutions. We like people who can give us an answer. When we come up to a problem or a conundrum, we like to go back and say, okay, what do the experts say? Or, what does YouTube have as a video for this? Who has done this before? And what did they do? And maybe if we can do what they do, we can fix what we have. Maybe it's the same thing. And so we look for a technical solution. But the reality is the expert who figured this out did it a couple of years ago. They may still have books, they might still be speaking, but those technical solutions, the world is changing so fast. And now we're in a different place. And actually, those technical solutions don't necessarily even apply to our context. They don't live where we live. They don't know who we know. They don't know this group. So what do? Well, they were talking in this podcast about adaptive leadership. Adaptive leadership. Well, what's that? It's basically saying we are facing things that we've never faced before, and there are no easy answers. So let's go on a journey together. We're facing things we've never faced before. And this is where I think sometimes we have a gap, where maybe you don't know what that is. And I want to try to help you and answer questions when you say, well, what are these big mysterious challenges that you're talking about, Pastor? What are these things that are so revolutionary that we can't just go back and do what we did? I don't have that all wrapped up either. I have some ideas, and I'll share them as we go, but I want your questions, and I want to have conversations with you to help sort some of that out. But the invite is the journey, to say, let's go on a journey to discover this way forward, because I don't think there's a quick or easy technical solution to how we do things. Part of what I realized in this is that we make the path by walking. We make the path by walking. That there's no group of people that is us with this leader in this context that has ever done this before. There are other churches in town. There's a lot of them, actually. And they're doing what they're doing. And they're following whatever God's leading them to do. But it is what it is, and you can see what they're doing. They know what they're doing. Maybe, maybe not. But I think we're called to be who we are in this place and to do the things that we're going to be doing. So we make the path by walking. And it reminded me of a time when I was in Guam and we took a hike. It was on my birthday. And we went for a hike with Gary Bisterton. And if you know Gary, he's quite an adventurous guy. And again, hiking in Guam is kind of unlike what you have here, or with Gary. And sometimes you think, well, there should be a trail, right? Shouldn't there be a trail somewhere? And Gary would be like, well, it's somewhere in here. And it's jungle. This is tropical island jungle. So it's somewhere in here, and there's a pool of water down here that's great to swim in, and we'll just, follow me, we'll go, and it's in this direction. Well, I think we brought a machete with us because we ended up having to sort of cut our way through and over trees and under trees and deadfall and all these things, and you're just, I remember we came upon a patch in the middle of this jungle that was like, oh, all of these plants look the same. And they don't actually seem like they're naturally growing here. It seems like these plants have been planted here. Now in Canada, all of those plants are now legal, and you could buy them at any of our 17 dispensaries here in town. But at the time, you're like, oh, well, let's keep moving before the owners of this little operation come, and we'll keep finding this secret pool as Pastor Gary leads us through the jungle. And we eventually did make it there, but man, was that a grueling hike. It was hard. It's hard work to make the path while you walk. And I feel like and it's slow, but I feel like that's kind of what we're doing. And I feel like that's what adaptive leadership is doing. It takes direction over the details. There wasn't a clear path. We didn't know, but we knew the direction. Gary knew the direction we needed to go, and we got there with some stories to tell. The other thing the other phrase that came out of this podcast was the idea of learning to lead from the workshop. And I just love that idea. You'll probably hear me say that quite a bit, but learning to lead from the workshop. This is a little bit of a different type of leadership. It's a bit more with you. It's not okay, everybody, let's go, down the path. It's really like gathering together and walking in the same direction and making the path as we travel it. But it takes some experimentation. It takes some new ideas. It takes some adjustments and some creativity and things maybe we haven't done or tried before. Will we succeed? Well, it really depends on the question, what do we measure? And so what should we measure? That's the question. What should we measure? Well, the two things that are easiest and quickest that come to mind are, number one, the great commandment. When teachers would approach Jesus and say, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment?" He would say, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." Basically, it's two for one. I think we do pretty good at this. I think we're learning and growing in it, and it's something that is pretty tangible. But I think part of what we've tried to do, even in this season of 77 days, is to help you learn to love each other better. To know each other. You can't love each other if you don't know each other. So that's part of why we did the refuel meals instead of a book study or a Bible study. I was all set to launch that, and then I was like, man, if we do this again, there's going to be no new connections. Because to have the Bible study on the same night at the same time means it basically writes off every parent with kids. It doesn't include our children. It leaves out a huge chunk of this small group of people. And we realize, there's a lot of times that people even within our small group have not really connected. Jesus even said that people would know, it would be a distinctive of the Christians that they would love each other. They will know you by your love. So, we got to learn to love each other. That takes some work too. So that's the one thing we should measure. How are we doing at loving each other? Right? The church isn't meant to be a closed, insular club, but if we're not loving each other, how are we going to love our neighbors, our community? It's going to be hard to do that. We want to be measured by the Great Commandment. And then the second thing is the Great Commission. The Great Commission, Matthew 28, where he talks about go into all the world and make disciples. And that's the other thing we need to measure. How are we doing at that? How are we doing at making disciples? You know, I understand some of that happens within our walls. Some of that happens with what we do on Sundays or here in our fellowship hall with kids' class or things like that, or book studies or Bible studies. Some of that happens as we help to equip you to raise your kids or your grandkids and help invest in them. That's discipleship as well. But I also think, how are we making disciples with people beyond that? How are we building those relationships and helping disciple people who will make more disciples? Because that's really part of the job of every Christian, not just pastors. But to say, how do we make disciples who make disciples? With God, we have everything it takes to do this. I don't think we are short of anything in order to do these two things. To love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. To love each other as ourselves. Love our community as ourselves. And to make disciples. I don't think we lack anything for that. We have God's Spirit. We have God's Word. We can do this. We have all that we need. But here's a little bit of the tension. And because, you know, as I've described what I'm feeling, right? So that maybe you haven't felt this or observed this, and that's fine. I'm just telling you from my perspective. Here's a bit of the tension. I feel called to make disciples, but I also feel like I can't do that work very well with the tools I have. Like if the only tool I have to help make disciples is 1.5 hours on a Sunday morning, that's a really limited time frame. If all I'm doing is talking at you, it's really limited. If all I'm doing, you know, if that's all we're doing to connect, when I think about what Jesus did to make disciples, it was very different. They did life together. They spent time with one another. They did things together. They wanted to be there. Sometimes they didn't want to be together, but they were brought together by Him. And together, sometimes they rubbed each other the wrong way. Sometimes there was conflict. There was a lot of times they didn't understand what He was teaching. But in all of it, it was more than 1.5 hours a week, is what I would just say. And so that's the tension I feel it a little bit is, how do we do this? How do I help you, and how do you help me? How do we do this work of making disciples if all we plan for and all we do is 1.5 hours on Sunday? I just think we've got to, that's part of the tension. I don't have all the answers. I'm just saying this is a tension I feel. And so what I want to explore is, how else can we do this? How do we invite people in? How do we give people inroads and on-ramps? How do we give people opportunities to serve together and love each other? And we've been doing that. We've had Car Care Saturday. We've had Trunk or Treat. We've had now the toy drive. So we're doing this, which partly is forming us as a people, even as we serve our community. And everybody has to choose, you know, where do you want to be involved? How much more do you want? Maybe no more. That's fine. But I just need to share that I feel like God is calling us into something deeper. And I don't know what all that is. And you don't have to start at all in. Some of you are. Some of you are like, I'm all in, Pastor. I'm all in. That's great. Others are saying like, what? I need to understand this a little more. And that's fine too. I'm just hoping you have a little bit of a curiosity or a stirring or something that would even just say like, God, I want to see what you're going to do. I love that song that we sung, Where You Go, I'll Go. Where you stay, I'll stay. Whom you love, I'll love. How you serve, I'll serve. That's kind of the posture that I have right now. Like, God, I don't know exactly what all you're doing here. I don't know how deep you want us to go. I don't know exactly what that's going to be, but I want to sing that with all my heart. That's my prayer. That's my prayer for you, that there be at least a stirring, that the Holy Spirit would stir something within you to say, yeah, I'm in. I'm still in. Let's go. Let's see what God has for us. There's no current model for us to imitate in my books. I learned from other churches and pastors and things. There's things that we can do, and there's things that we're going to try. And to be fair, maybe many of you have never done church any different. Why would we need to change it? What's wrong with what we've always done? That's a good question. I would love to chat with you more about it. And I didn't say it was wrong. I just feel like it's going to be limiting. And the world is changing really fast. But that's where we want to go, I think, is this idea of leading from the workshop, observing where God is at and joining Him in it. And then really, hopefully, to have you trust God enough that He's at work here, that even as we do some experiments and some new discoveries and then reevaluating and some adaptation and stuff, that we trust that we will make the path by walking. That God is leading us. And that was part of this whole story. Is we looked at the Exodus and we said, what are some of these traits? What did God do with His people? He was forming a people for a purpose. And how did He do that? Well, He led them, right? He led them. He gave them direction. He provided for their needs. He developed new habits. But there's also times of testing. Will you trust me? Will you hang on to me when you're in the desert? Will you trust that I'm going to lead you? And then through that, there was a bonding. When we go through difficult times together, there's a bonding, there's a unifying that comes from that. And someday there's different levels of arrival. I mean, we're never fully there, but I think there will be a little bit more of a sense of arriving to something new when we get there. And you'll know it. You'll know that. So it's an invitation today to keep walking with us, with me, with the Lord, as we follow Jesus into our future.